Shabbat Shalom. I know many of us are preparing for a holiday weekend, preparing to celebrate America with barbecues and fireworks, as we should. But first and foremost, please be safe. But at the same time, if you, like me, have spent the last day or two reading the news, we're seeing decisions by the United States Supreme Court that are announced that seem to be turning programs and ethics of American equality on their head. We seem to be at this place where at the one point we're celebrating America and at the other point we're struggling in America, all in this same week. In the case of students for fair admissions versus Harvard, the Supreme Court ended affirmative action. Universities will no longer be able to take proactive steps now to diversify their student body. They will not be able to ask students if they come from any sort of particular background. And in another decision announced this week, 303 Creative versus Alenis, in this case, the court decided that a business can refuse service to someone based on their beliefs about that person. The case was about a web designer whose company is open to the public, but who refused to serve same-sex couples. But one might imagine that the extension of this decision would be that someone can now say that my business is open to the public, but only to the public that I agree it should be open to. Only those whom I agree with, or who look like me, or who pray like me. That's the public that I want to serve, not the entire public. So here we are as we celebrate the 4th of July, a day of independence, of freedom, when the entirety of our country, no matter your religion or your race or your sexuality, comes together simply because we are here in America. And we're also watching our country continue to create barriers that prevent people from walking into a store, from going to a university because of their race, their religion, their sexuality, preventing people from studying together, from working together, from generally coexisting. It seems like two very different stories happening at the same time. I subscribe to the American Jewish Archives Journal. I imagine there aren't many of you in here who received that journal. It's a wonderful journal created by the American Jewish Archives, a great institution in Cincinnati that if you ever have the chance to visit, I encourage you to. And it shares American history, stories we would never find on our own, stories found by people who are doing PhDs in things we can't understand, people who spend their life doing a deep dive on some Jewish leader from the 18th or 19th century. And so I always find that these stories that would otherwise be lost are fascinating. And so with 4th of July happening this week, I turned to my series of journals and opened up an issue from last year with the hopes of sharing a piece of American Jewish history in light of the holiday. And here's where I landed. The 1927 Memorial Day Address by Robert S. Marks. Robert Marks was born in 1889 in Cincinnati. For those who might be Cincinnatians, he attended Walnut Hills High School, which still exists, and the University of Cincinnati, where he was the captain of the football team and a leading member of the debate team. In 1910, he passed the Ohio State bar exam, but shortly thereafter, he, like many of his peers, served in the American Armed Forces in World War I, where he was severely injured. And in fact, the paper reported that he had been killed, but he had survived. Marks was awarded the Purple Heart, the Distinguished Cross, and the Verdun Medal for bravery and valor in battle. And when he returned from war, still a young man, he decided to focus his efforts on creating what we now know as the Disabled American Veterans Organization. It remains today, and he eventually became a judge in Ohio's Superior Court. This is all to say that this young Jewish Ohioan from a century ago was strong both physically, intellectually. He was a good leader, morally, we might say, in what he did after he came back from the war, and that our country honored him for these traits. But what I find more important are the way that this Jewish American leader approached his country and defended his minority status. And so I've shared with you his resume, but as I think David Brooks wrote years ago, sometimes it's the eulogy that we really need to hear. And so this is not his eulogy, but this is what I imagine is part of what might have been shared. During his time as a trial lawyer in the 1920s, Marx was known for having flair in the courtroom. And so during a trial involving a Jewish client, an anti-Semitic comment was made. When it was Marx's turn to address the jury, he approached the jurors, dramatically took off his shirt, and pointed to the scars that he had received in the First World War. He said, "Nobody asked in battle if I was a Jew or a Gentile." The jury was said to be in tears when he finished speaking, and he won the case. In his Memorial Day speech in 1927, he used a similar tactic. He wrote, "Throughout the length and breadth of this land on this Memorial Day, there will be parades of fast thinning ranks of soldiers who served in the Civil War, soldiers who served in the Spanish-American War, and their youthful comrades of the World War. And along the streets where these parades pass, there will be many a sad and many a proud mother, and many a Jewish mother." He took moments to point out the fact that, yes, he was American, and guess what? I'm also Jewish, and that makes me no less American. In fact, I fight the same wars and walk the same streets and celebrate in the same parades as you do. He reminded Americans that diversity is not something that came after we were a country, but something that came and made us a country. In his speech, he makes sure to point out that Jewish Americans disproportionately joined the military in World War I and disproportionately served in the infantry, despite the very common anti-Semitic tropes of the time, which claimed that Jews avoided combat. They dodged the war, or they joined platoons that wouldn't be sent to battle. He showed them data and proved them wrong. Toward the conclusion of his speech, he paints two clear images. The first is directed at how we see the diversity of America. He writes, "If you want to know the full story of the part played by the American Jew in the World War, you must visit the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery in northern France." I hope I'm pronouncing that right. "Above the grave of every Christian soldier, there is the cross of Jesus. And above the grave of every Jewish soldier, there is the Star of David. But my friends, the glory that is above them, above every one of their graves, is the Stars and Stripes, the symbol of American liberty." He paints a picture that we might differentiate ourselves on the ground, but above us, we are one country. He shares a second story, one that brought the audience he was speaking to, they say, in 1927, to stand and applause, although I won't ask you to do that here. As I read it, it struck me that perhaps this is the type of message somebody who was the captain of their football team learns to share. He said, referring to a trip in which he returned to Europe, to France, with dignitaries, as he had become more or less an American dignitary himself. He said, "After we visited the cemeteries in France, we returned to Paris, where we were invited to the Arch of Triumph to place an American flag over the grave of the unknown French soldier who lies buried under the arch. As we prepared for the ceremony, we were told that civilians are never permitted to march beneath the Arch of Triumph. It is reserved for victorious armies returning from battle. And so when the ceremony ended and we were standing under the arch, we didn't know what to do. Our commander turned to Marshal Foch, former French head of the Allied Supreme Command, who was leading the ceremony. And he whispered, 'Where do we go now? Do we go back? Are we supposed to turn around to the place where we've come?' But immediately, Foch answered in 4 words, 'Americans never turn back.'" And so Marx closes the speech, referencing this story and saying, "The question before this nation is whether we are going back the way we have come, whether we are going back to the days of religious bigotry and intolerance, whether we are going back to the days of Ku Kluxism, or whether we are going on to realize the great ideals of American liberty, of American justice, of American tolerance, for which this country was founded. Although our progress may be slow, he writes, I believe there's only one answer, because Americans never turn back. And so as we enter this weekend, I call upon his story, a story in which he was able to point out the contrast of our country, as we enter a weekend of such contrast. On the one hand, the headlines in the paper reminding us how we are divided, how Americans do not tolerate each other or see each other as equals in a land of liberty and justice. On the other hand, we will hear songs and see the colors that remind us of our unity and of our most deeply held American values. Values like justice and liberty and freedom. And so as we enter this weekend of contrasts, I hope a little bit of Judge Robert Marks is in our ear from a century ago, reminding us to speak up, to remind people that Jewish Americans, just like African Americans and gay Americans, have earned every bit of being fully equal in the eyes of our country, that the stars and stripes are intended to fly above all of us. And when we feel that equality is being attacked, that bigotry is being amplified, whether it's in our courts or in our neighborhoods, in our colleges, or perhaps when we go to order a wedding cake on a website, that our job is the American job, to keep pushing forward because we are not a people who will ever tolerate turning back to the worst of our history. Shabbat Shalom.